Have you ever served on a jury for a trial? I served on a couple juries, and I believe in the judicial system. But serving on these juries showed me that the justice system is not perfect. Mistakes are made, and jury members can be less than objective as they decide the evidence. And in the case of the first trial I served on, we ended up with a hung jury, with all but one jurist believing that the person on trial was guilty. I left the courthouse that day thinking that we didn't get it right that day, that we let a guilty man go free. The justice system was far from perfect 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem when Jesus was on trial. An innocent man was given a death sentence in an extremely rushed hearing in which Pilate, the Roman governor, was pressured to do the wrong thing by an angry vocal mob. And they got it wrong that day. And so we see this story in John 19, beginning with verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat, on a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priest answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. Before Pilate saw Jesus, Jesus had already been on trial before the religious leaders, specifically Annas, the former Jewish high priest, and Caiaphas, the current high priest, and the Sanhedrin. And think of the Sanhedrin as the Jewish Supreme Court. The Sanhedrin found Jesus guilty of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God. And with that charge, Jesus is brought before Pilate. Pilate obviously wants nothing to do with the case. He doesn't see that Jesus has done anything wrong. And when he discovers that Jesus is a Galilean, he sends him to Herod Antipas, because Galilee was under Herod's jurisdiction. Pilate didn't want to deal with Jesus at all, and by passing him on to Herod, he thought he was done with him. Well, Herod asked Jesus a few questions, but gets frustrated when Jesus doesn't answer. And so he sends him back to Pilate. This is not what Pilate wanted at all. He's again confronted with an innocent Jesus and an angry mob, and he comes to realize that nobody's going to bail him out. He's got to decide for himself whether Jesus will be killed or will go free. So we're going to focus on Pilate today, since he was the one who actually allowed the execution of Christ. And as we do, we notice Pilate is lacking in three primary areas. He was lacking in principles, he was lacking in power, and he was lacking in perception. First, we see Pilate's lack of principles. Pilate had Jesus flogged, although he knew that Jesus was innocent. Pilate was trying hard to free Jesus because he didn't want his death on his conscience. So Pilate thought that he would flog Jesus, and then the Jews would be satisfied. The job of flogging was performed by the Roman soldiers. But before the flogging began, the soldiers decided, let's have a little bit of fun tormenting Jesus. So first, the Roman soldiers jammed a crown of long, sharp thorns on Jesus' head. And this crown of thorns might have come from a date palm. The date palm's thorns can grow to be quite long, sometimes more than a foot long. The length of these thorns would allow them to be woven into a crown, with the thorns pointing upward above the crown. The thorny crown was intended to mimic the wreaths of Hellenistic kings. So although most of the thorns were probably not intentionally directed inward toward the head, some thorns certainly did scrape and poke into his head and draw blood from Jesus' scalp. We remember that after Adam sinned in the garden, that God pronounced judgment on him. And God tells Adam, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field." So thorns and thistles were a result of mankind's sin. And so it seems fitting that Jesus would wear a crown of thorns as he bore the sins of the world on the cross. Well, then the soldiers put a purple robe on Jesus' back. This was probably a military cloak used as a royal robe. Purple was the color of royalty, so the crown of thorns and purple robe were meant to mock Jesus, him being the king of the Jews. Next, the Roman soldiers ridiculed Jesus further by bowing before him and striking him. And the verb tenses in the Greek text here in John 19:3 indicate that the soldiers repeatedly mocked him over and over again, beating him with their hands. And after this painful humiliation, the soldiers got down to the task and finally got down to flogging Jesus. And flogging was merciless. Leather whips were used, and the whips had sharp pieces of metal or bone attached. I grew up in the era of discipline to children that included spankings and whippings. And in our home, spankings were administered by hand. But leather belts were used for whippings. And one of the greatest fears I can remember as a child was knowing that I was about to receive a whipping by a belt. They were painful. But as painful as they were, I have to keep in mind that my whippings were administered by loving parents who were punishing me for my own good. But what if my parents chose to whip me with one of those studded belts that some people think are fashionable? A studded belt would not only hurt, it would cause some major damage. I'd end up bruised and bloodied. My parents would probably have ended up arrested for child abuse. Obviously, such an instrument of punishment is just cruel. When the soldiers whipped people, the whips they used were far worse than a studded belt. The whip alone would cause major damage to the skin. But with the sharp metal and bone pieces attached, the whip would dig into the flesh. So flogging was not just painful. It often killed a person. The way Pilate saw it, flogging Jesus was a good compromise. It would be severe, but probably not fatal. So Pilate, in flogging Jesus, didn't have the courage to do the right thing. Flogging Jesus was still wrong. It was a compromise. But in Pilate's mind, it wasn't as wrong as crucifying him. Pilate decided to flog Jesus, not based on his conviction that Jesus was guilty. Rather, it was based on a compromise with an angry mob. It takes courage to do the right thing. And Pilate didn't have the courage to stand up to the angry crowd. For him, it was easier to beat an innocent man nearly to death than to tell the crowd that they were wrong and let Jesus go. So after beating Jesus, he brings him out for the crowd to see. And Pilate hoped that the sight of this beaten, bloody person would cause the crowd to have pity on Jesus and make them realize that there could be no possible threat from him. But as he presented him, beaten and bloody to the people, he said, "Here is the man." Pilate was basically saying, "Look at this poor guy. Hasn't he suffered enough? Take pity on him and let me release him." So Pilate was trying to strategically punish Jesus just enough so the people would begin to feel sorry for him and change their minds. He wanted to bring them to the point where they would refuse to go through with their plan to kill him. However, Pilate's efforts failed. Their minds were made up. And even as Jesus was presented to them beaten and bruised and bloodied, the consensus was that he hadn't suffered enough, and they called for him to be crucified. Pilate says, "But I find him not guilty." This is the third time that Pilate has pronounced his innocence. But this time, the crowd might well have shouted, "Then why did you have him flogged?" Pilate's actions contradicted his words. He was like a lot of politicians, hoping to find some kind of a happy compromise that would please everybody. But in the end, Pilate did release Jesus to be crucified, although he knew Jesus was innocent. Pilate caved. In the end, what little principles he had were abandoned. If Pilate truly believed that Jesus was innocent, then why did he give in? Why did he allow Jesus to be crucified? It's because he was more concerned with self-preservation than justice. He didn't want a riot because he didn't want to lose his job, or worse, his life. And when people screamed at him, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar's," Pilate was shaken. Tiberius was on the throne, and he was sick and suspicious and often violent. And Pilate had plenty to cover up, and he didn't want an unfavorable report to go to his boss. And Pilate's job was to keep peace in the region. He was expected to maintain control by crushing rebellions immediately with brute force. So if a riot started in Jerusalem on his watch, Pilate would look incompetent, and Caesar would not be happy. If he had to choose between showing his loyalty to Rome or siding with a despised and strange Jew, there was no question in his mind Jesus had to go. Pilate didn't have the integrity to do the right thing. He knew what the right thing was. He wrestled with it. But in the end, justice was not served. Pilate did not do the right thing. Next, we see Pilate's lack of power. Pilate had limited power over the people in Jerusalem. And while it's true that Pilate was the man in charge of Jerusalem, there was also a certain amount of power held by the people. There is power in numbers. If it looked like the entire city of Jerusalem was ready to revolt, fueled by the influence of the religious leaders, then Pilate had a big problem on his hands. His power is being challenged in a major way. And look what the people were screaming at Pilate. "If you let Jesus go, you are no friend of Caesar's." I can't imagine any individual there saying that to Pilate one-on-one. He wouldn't dare. Pilate would have his head. But together, the people had boldness and power. This is basically why unions exist today. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that union members are like the angry mob calling for Christ's death. But the truth is, there is power in numbers. Individually, none of the people would have the courage or the power to confront Pilate and demand Jesus' death. But together, they are bold and they are powerful. And Pilate can't ignore their demands. He has to somehow satisfy them. The only other option is to wipe out everyone in the city, but that's not going to happen. He had to deal with what they were saying. Pilate also had limited power over Jesus. And during a private discussion with Jesus, Pilate said to him, "Don't you realize that I have the power to release you or to crucify you?" So Pilate was trying to impress upon Jesus that he was a powerful person. He could make a decision to crucify Jesus, or he could decide to set him free. But Jesus answered him by saying, "You would have no power over me at all unless it were given to you from above." Jesus was not impressed with Pilate's power. Why? Because compared to Jesus, Pilate was powerless. Jesus plainly let him know that any power he had in this situation was given to him by God. That's a good thing for us to keep in mind. God is omnipotent. He is on his throne. He has all power and always will. And when life gets dark and confusing, God is still in control. And finally, we see Pilate's lack of perception. Pilate didn't understand Jesus. When the religious leaders said that Jesus should die because he calls himself the Son of God, Pilate started freaking out. So he had a strange conversation with Jesus in which he asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" He wasn't asking Jesus what his hometown was. Pilate knew he was from Galilee. He was Jesus of Nazareth. He was asking if Jesus was from planet Earth or if he was a god from somewhere else. Pilate was a superstitious man in a superstitious world, and the idea of gods appearing on earth was not uncommon. Pilate had already been impressed by Jesus' words and his attitude. He'd never seen a prisoner like Jesus before. Was he indeed a god come to earth? Did he indeed have supernatural powers? Also, Matthew's gospel tells us that Pilate's wife had sent him a strange message that he should have nothing to do with Jesus. Jesus had even come into her dreams. So Pilate couldn't figure Jesus out. He thought that Jesus might be some kind of a god, but didn't understand he really was God. Pilate had a great amount of superstition, but no faith. He dabbled in spiritual things, but had faith in nothing real. He reminds me of people today, especially celebrities, who talk about their spiritual life, but don't have a clue about God. Without a saving faith in Jesus, all that talk about a spiritual life is just talk, nothing more. Jesus makes it real. So Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified. And as he did, he tried his best to distance himself from his decision. He very reluctantly gave in to the crowd, going against what he knew in his heart to be right. And as he did, Pilate was found lacking in principles, lacking in power, and lacking in perception. But Jesus was not lacking. He remained calm and in control. He was perfectly carrying out God's plan to offer himself as the flawless Lamb of God who would die for the sins of the world.